The communications blackout had been going on for 17 hours when she walked through the gates of Forward Operating Base Ridgeline. No radio contact with command, no satellite uplinks, no encrypted channels working beyond a half-mile radius. Just dead air where critical intelligence should have been flowing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant Tommy Briggs barely looked up from the pile of dismantled radio equipment scattered across his workbench when the new arrival was escorted into the communications bunker. Another specialist, he figured, was sent from headquarters to ask the same questions everyone else had been asking. How long until communications were restored? What was causing the interference? When would they have contact with the outside world again? She wore standard desert fatigues with no unit. Patches, no rank insignia visible, just a name tape that read Davidson in regulation black letters. Her gear bag was worn canvas, military issue but older than current standard equipment. The kind of bag that had seen deployments in places that weren't supposed to exist on official maps. Sergeant Briggs? Her voice carried the flat neutrality of someone accustomed to dealing with military bureaucracy. I'm here about your communication situation. Briggs gestured toward the chaos surrounding his workstation without enthusiasm. Radio components covered every available surface, their metal casings reflecting the harsh fluorescent lighting that never seemed adequate for the detailed work required to diagnose complex electronic failures. Cables snaked between partially assembled units, connecting test equipment that had been running diagnostic routines for the past 6 hours without producing useful results. Take a look around, he said, wiping grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better days. We've got 14 radio systems down, satellite communications completely dark, and interference patterns that don't match anything in the technical manuals. Command sent you to fix what 3 communications specialists couldn't figure out. Davidson moved to the bunker with deliberate efficiency, examining each piece of equipment without touching anything, observing the diagnostic displays. With the focused attention of someone processing information faster than conversation allowed. Her eyes tracked across frequency readouts, signal strength meters, and spectral analysis charts that covered the walls like abstract art made from technical data. The other communications personnel watched her with a mixture of hope and skepticism that characterized military responses to unexpected assistance. Corporal Lisa Wang had been working on the primary command radio for 8 hours, following troubleshooting procedures that should have identified any standard equipment failure. Private Marcus Webb sat, surrounded by antenna components, each one tested and retested without revealing the source of their communications isolation. Does anyone check the atmospheric conditions? Davidson asked, still examining the equipment arrays without direct interaction. First thing we did, Wang replied, pointing to weather data printouts taped to the wall. Clear skies, minimal humidity, no solar storm activity, no magnetic anomalies reported by meteorological services. Whatever's killing our signals isn't environmental. Davidson nodded, moving to a workstation where signal analysis equipment displayed waveforms that resembled abstract sculptures more than recognizable communication patterns. The interference signatures were unlike anything in standard military references, not electronic warfare jamming, not natural atmospheric disturbance, not equipment malfunction that followed predictable patterns. How about the local population? Davidson continued her questions with the systematic approach of someone following a mental checklist that wasn't visible to others. Any new construction, industrial facilities, civilian radio installations that might be generating interference? Webb shook his head. We're 60 miles from the nearest town, and that's just a trading post with maybe 30 people. No radio stations, no cellular towers, no industrial facilities that would have the power to create this kind of widespread interference. The forward operating base had been experiencing intermittent Communications difficulties for weeks before the complete blackout occurred. Initially dismissed as routine equipment degradation in harsh desert conditions, the problems had escalated gradually until all radio frequencies became unusable within a specific geographic radius that seemed to center on their location. Intelligence. Reports suggested enemy forces were operating in the region, but without reliable communications, confirming threats or coordinating responses had become impossible. The base was effectively operating blind, dependent on visual observation and short-range tactical communications that functioned only within direct line of sight. "What about the backup systems?" Davidson asked, though her tone suggested she already anticipated the answer. "Dead," Briggs confirmed. "Primary communication suite, secondary backup array, emergency radio systems. Even the handheld units are getting nothing but static once you move beyond the immediate perimeter. It's like there's an invisible wall surrounding this entire area that blocks all radio frequency transmission." Davidson paused at a workstation displaying frequency spectrum analysis, studying waveform patterns with an intensity that made the other personnel exchange glances. She wasn't just looking at the data. She was analyzing it with the kind of focused concentration that suggested understanding the underlying principles that created those patterns. After several minutes of silent observation, she turned to examine the main communications array, a complex assembly of radio equipment that represented millions of dollars in advanced military technology, all of it currently functioning as expensive static generators. "Mind if I take a look at the primary unit?" she asked, though she was already moving toward the equipment before receiving permission. Briggs gestured toward the radio with the resignation of someone who'd watched multiple specialists fail to solve the same problem. "Help yourself. Just don't make it worse than it already is." Davidson approached the radio with the careful attention of someone who understood that complex electronic systems could be damaged by improper handling. She examined the external connections, the antenna coupling systems, the power supply configurations, noting details that the other technicians had checked repeatedly without discovering anything unusual. But when she opened the equipment housing to examine the internal components, something changed in her expression. Not surprise, not confusion, just the subtle recognition of someone who had encountered similar situations before. She studied the circuit boards, the frequency synthesis modules, and the signal processing components with systematic thoroughness. Her examination wasn't random troubleshooting. It was methodical analysis that followed patterns the other personnel couldn't recognize. "Interesting," she murmured, though her tone suggested the situation was more than merely interesting. "The interference isn't external. It's internal, built into the frequency allocation itself." Huang moved closer, trying to understand what Davidson had observed that everyone else had missed. "What do you mean, built into the frequency allocation?" Davidson's response was interrupted by the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor outside the communications bunker. Colonel Patricia Stone, the base commander, entered with the determined stride of someone who expected progress reports that would finally explain why her forward operating base had been cut off from all external communication for nearly 18 hours. "Sergeant Briggs, what's our status?" she asked, then noticed Davidson examining the radio equipment with unusual focus. "And who might you be?" "Davidson, ma'am. I was sent to assess your communication situation." The colonel's expression suggested she was accustomed to receiving assistance that failed to solve problems that stumped her regular personnel. "Any initial thoughts about what we're dealing with here?" Davidson straightened, her hands still positioned near the radio components as if maintaining physical connection to equipment that had become the center of everyone's attention. The interference patterns suggest deliberate signal manipulation rather than random electronic failure. Someone with advanced knowledge of military communication protocols is actively disrupting your radio frequencies. The statement hung in the Air like a revelation that changed everything about how they understood their current situation. They weren't dealing with equipment failure or atmospheric conditions. They were dealing with an adversary who possessed the technical knowledge to neutralize their communications through methods that weren't documented in any standard military references. Davidson moved to the frequency analyzer with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what needed to be done. Her fingers danced across the control interface, adjusting parameters that Briggs had checked dozens of times without achieving meaningful results. But under her manipulation, the equipment began displaying waveform patterns that revealed structures hidden within what had appeared to be random interference. The jamming signal is using phase-locked modulation, she explained while fine-tuning the analysis parameters. It's not just blocking your frequencies, it's mimicking your radio signatures and creating destructive interference that cancels out your transmissions before they can establish communication links. Colonel Stone moved closer, studying the display readouts that were beginning to show coherent patterns instead of chaotic noise. That level of signal processing requires sophisticated equipment and detailed knowledge of our communication protocols. Who has that capability in this region? Davidson's hands never stopped working as she spoke, reconfiguring the radio systems, frequency synthesis modules with modifications that weren't covered in any standard technical manual. Someone who understands military communications architecture well enough to exploit vulnerabilities that most people don't know exist. She pulled a small device from her gear bag, a handheld frequency counter that looked like standard military issue but had been modified with additional circuitry that extended its capabilities beyond normal specifications. The device connected to the radio system through interfaces that shouldn't have been compatible but somehow functioned perfectly under her configuration. "What are you doing?" Wong asked, watching Davidson work with techniques that didn't match anything from their technical training. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Mapping the jamming signal's source characteristics, Davidson replied, monitoring readouts that provided information about the hostile transmission's location and power output. Once we understand how the interference is structured, we can develop countermeasures that neutralize its effectiveness. The process took 12 minutes. 12 minutes during which Davidson reconfigured radio equipment that had been non-functional for 17 hours, transforming it into a sophisticated direction-finding system that could trace hostile signals to their point of origin. Her modifications turned standard military hardware into specialized electronic warfare equipment through techniques that seemed to emerge from understanding radio frequency principles at levels that exceeded normal engineering training. "Got it," she announced, pointing to coordinates that appeared on the modified display system. The jamming source is approximately 8 miles northwest of this position, operating from elevated terrain that provides line-of-sight coverage over this entire valley. But identifying the jamming source was only the beginning of her demonstration. Davidson began implementing countermeasures that involved frequency hopping patterns, so complex that the radio system struggled to process them within normal operational parameters. She was pushing military communications equipment beyond its designed limitations through programming modifications that shouldn't have been possible without manufacturer-level access to proprietary software. "This is incredible," Webb muttered, watching frequency displays show successful signal transmission for the first time in nearly a day. "How did you figure out those modifications so quickly?" Davidson didn't answer immediately, focusing on stabilizing the communication links that were beginning to establish contact with distant command posts. Static resolved into clear audio as radio channels came online with reception quality that exceeded their normal operational standards. "Base Ridgeline. This is Command Authority. We have been attempting to establish contact for 16 hours. What is your status?" Colonel Stone grabbed the microphone with relief that was visible across her entire posture. "Command Authority, this is Base Ridgeline. We experienced extended communications blackouts due to hostile electronic warfare operations. Communications are now restored through specialist intervention." While the colonel provided situation reports to higher command, Davidson continued working on the radio systems, implementing additional modifications that seemed designed to prevent future jamming attempts. Her fingers moved across control interfaces with muscle memory that suggested extensive experience with equipment configurations that weren't taught in standard military technical schools. "The jamming system they were using," she explained to the gathered communications personnel, "exploits a vulnerability in the frequency coordination protocols. Most military radios assume friendly forces are using compatible signal processing methods. The jamming source was generating signals that looked like friendly transmissions but were phase-inverted to create destructive interference." Briggs studied the waveform analysis that Davidson had revealed, noting technical details that had been completely invisible during 17 hours of troubleshooting. "I've been working in communications for 8 years, and I've never seen anything like this. Where did you learn to recognize those interference patterns?" Davidson's response was interrupted by sudden activity on the newly restored radio channels. Multiple frequencies began receiving transmissions that weren't coming from friendly forces. Enemy communications that had been previously masked by the same jamming signals that had blocked their own radio contact. "We're intercepting hostile communications," Huang reported, adjusting receiver settings to optimize signal clarity. "Multiple tactical frequencies, encrypted transmissions, coordination between units that appear to be planning operations in this sector." The enemy chatter revealed more than anyone had expected. Grid coordinates for positions throughout the valley, timing data for coordinated movements, references to weapon systems that suggested capabilities beyond what intelligence our EPORTS had indicated. The hostile forces weren't just operating in the region. They were preparing for major offensive operations using the communications blackout as cover for their final preparations. Davidson listened to the intercepted transmissions with the focused attention of someone who understood not just the technical aspects of radio communication, but the tactical implications of what they were hearing. Her expression suggested recognition of operational patterns that extended beyond simple eavesdropping on enemy conversations. "They're using your own communication protocols," she observed, fine-tuning the interception equipment to capture additional frequencies. "The jamming wasn't just intended to isolate your base. It was designed to prevent you from discovering their communication methods until their operation was ready to proceed." But as Davidson continued optimizing the radio reception, something unexpected happened. The enemy transmissions began changing, shifting to different frequencies, altering encryption methods, adapting their communication patterns in real-time response to being intercepted. "They know we're listening," Webb reported, watching frequency displays show rapid changes in hostile signal characteristics. "They're implementing countermeasures." Davidson's response was immediate and decisive. She began implementing modifications to the radio equipment that transformed it into an active electronic warfare system, capable of not just intercepting enemy communications, but disrupting them through precisely targeted interference that overwhelmed their signal processing capabilities. Within minutes, the enemy chatter that had been revealing their operational plans began degrading into unintelligible static. Their attempts to change frequencies were met with jamming signals that followed their transmissions across the spectrum, maintaining interference that prevented effective communication regardless of which channels they attempted to use. "Their communications are completely suppressed," Huang reported with amazement that bordered on disbelief. "Whatever you did to our equipment, it's now jamming them more effectively than they were jamming us." Davidson stepped back from the radio equipment. observing the results of her work with satisfaction that seemed to emerge from familiarity with similar situations. The communications blackout that had isolated Base Ridgeline for 17 hours had been not just resolved, but reversed, transforming their radio systems into electronic warfare platforms that had neutralized hostile communications across the entire operational area. Colonel Stone finished her reports to higher command and turned to Davidson with questions that everyone in the communications bunker was thinking but hadn't yet asked. Where exactly did you learn to do that? Those modifications aren't covered in any technical manual I've ever seen, and I've been in military communications for 15 years. Davidson began packing her equipment with the same methodical efficiency she displayed throughout her work. Some problems require approaches that aren't documented in standard procedures. The answer didn't satisfy anyone's curiosity about her background, but the results spoke for themselves. Communications had been restored, enemy operations had been discovered and disrupted, and their radio equipment was now functioning at levels that exceeded normal specifications through modifications that seemed to emerge from understanding electronic warfare principles at depths that went far beyond standard military training. Colonel Stone waited until Davidson had finished securing the modified radio equipment before pulling Sergeant Briggs aside for a conversation that needed to happen. Away from listening ears. The communications bunker had returned to normal operational status, but questions about their mysterious specialist were multiplying faster than answers could be found. Briggs, I need you to run a background check on Davidson through military personnel databases. Those modifications she implemented aren't taught in any communications school I know about, and her equipment includes devices that aren't available through normal supply channels. Briggs nodded, understanding the implications behind the colonel's request. Personnel who demonstrated capabilities beyond their official training often carried histories that required careful investigation. What level of clearance should I use for the database searches? Start with standard personnel records and work your way up. If her background requires higher clearance levels, we need to know that before this situation develops further. The investigation began with routine queries through the Defense Personnel Database, searching for service records under the name Davidson with communication specialties. What they found was immediately concerning, not because of what the records contained, but because of what they deliberately omitted. Technical Specialist E. Davidson appeared in the system with basic identification information, security clearances that granted access to classified facilities, and assignment orders that authorized temporary duty at Forward Operating Base Ridgeline. But her service history was almost entirely redacted, showing only entry date, current clearance levels, and a notation that additional records were classified under special access programs. This is weird, Briggs muttered, scrolling through database entries that raised more questions than they answered. She has clearances that I don't recognize, assignment codes that don't match any unit designations in the system, and her training records are completely classified. Corporal Huang, who had been monitoring radio communications to ensure their restored systems remained stable, overheard the conversation and moved closer. What kind of training records require that level of classification? The kind associated with programs that officially don't exist, Briggs replied, noting classification markers that indicated information was protected under protocols he'd never encountered during 8 years of military service. Meanwhile, Davidson continued working with the electronic warfare system she'd created from their modified radio equipment, fine-tuning parameters that maintained communication suppression over the hostile forces while ensuring their own radio channels remained clear and secure. Her familiarity with the complex procedures suggested someone who had performed similar operations repeatedly under conditions that weren't documented in official military records. She's not just technically skilled, Webb observed, watching Davidson optimize frequency, coordination with methods that seemed to emerge from practical experience rather than theoretical training. She works like someone who's done this specific type of electronic warfare in operational environments. The observation prompted Colonel Stone to expand her investigation beyond standard personnel databases. Using her command-level clearances, she accessed intelligence files that contained information about military personnel, whose backgrounds involved classified operations in electronic warfare and signals intelligence. The search results were both revealing and disturbing. References to Project Echo Chamber appeared in multiple documents, describing research initiatives that had developed advanced electronic warfare capabilities through integration of human operators with experimental communications technology. The program had been classified at levels that prevented most personnel from accessing basic information about its existence. Project Echo Chamber, Colonel Stone read from files that appeared on her secure terminal, was designed to create hybrid electronic warfare specialists whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations through neural integration with advanced signal processing systems. The project description explained methods that seemed designed to enhance human cognitive abilities specifically for electronic warfare applications. Operators underwent procedures that increased their ability to process multiple radio frequencies simultaneously, recognize complex signal patterns instantly, and implement countermeasures that required understanding of electronic systems at levels that normal training couldn't achieve. But the program had been terminated abruptly following incidents that were classified beyond the colonel's security clearance. References to operational complications and unexpected psychological effects suggested that enhancing human capabilities for electronic warfare had produced results that couldn't be controlled through normal military command structures. The participants, Colonel Stone continued reading, demonstrated abilities that exceeded program objectives, but exhibited behavioral patterns that raised concerns about long-term psychological stability and compliance with standard military protocols. More disturbing were references to program graduates who had disappeared from official records following the project's termination. Some were listed as killed in action during classified operations. Others were simply marked as status unknown, with notations that further inquiry was prohibited under national security. PROTOCOLC. Davidson's name appeared in a heavily redacted participant list, with notations indicating she had been the program's most successful subject. Her psychological evaluations described someone capable of processing electronic warfare scenarios that overwhelmed normal human cognitive capacity, but with concerning indications of emotional detachment from standard interpersonal relationships. She was declared missing in action during a classified mission 18 months ago. Colonel Stone discovered in files that required presidential-level clearance to access. Her status was changed to presumed dead when she failed to report for extraction following an electronic warfare operation in a location that's blacked out from this record. But dead people don't appear at forward operating bases with classified equipment and capabilities that exceed normal human limitations. While Colonel Stone investigated Davidson's background through official channels, Sergeant Briggs was conducting his own unofficial inquiry into the technical modifications she'd implemented on their radio equipment. His analysis revealed engineering approaches that weren't documented in any available technical manuals. These frequency synthesis modifications, he explained to his communications team, require understanding of signal processing principles that go beyond what's taught in military technical schools. She's not just using advanced techniques. She's innovating solutions that push our equipment beyond its designed capabilities. The modified radio systems were operating at performance levels that exceeded manufacturer specifications through programming changes that seemed to emerge from understanding electronic systems at fundamental levels that normal engineering training didn't provide. Davidson had essentially transformed standard military communications equipment into specialized electronic warfare platforms through modifications that suggested access to technical knowledge that wasn't available through conventional sources. More Concerning was evidence that Davidson's modifications were continuing to evolve without her direct intervention. The radio systems were adapting their electronic warfare capabilities in response to enemy countermeasures, implementing new jamming techniques automatically as hostile forces attempted to restore their communications. It's like she programmed the equipment to think for itself, Webb reported, monitoring displays that showed autonomous adaptation to changing electronic warfare conditions. The jamming patterns are becoming more sophisticated without anyone making manual adjustments. The investigation reached a critical point when Colonel Stone received a secure communication from higher command requesting immediate reports on any unusual electronic warfare activities in her operational sector. The inquiry came from intelligence agencies that didn't normally involve themselves in routine forward operating base communications. Colonel Stone, this is General Morrison from Strategic Communications Command. We've detected anomalous electronic warfare signatures originating from your location. Can you explain the source of these activities? The question carried implications that went beyond routine operational inquiries. Someone at very high levels of military command was monitoring electronic warfare activities around forward operating base ridgeline, suggesting that Davidson's presence and capabilities had attracted attention from agencies that operated above normal military hierarchy. Colonel Stone realized that her investigation into Davidson's background had revealed more than just classified training programs and experimental procedures. It had uncovered evidence that they were dealing with someone whose abilities and operational history were considered matters of national security interest by organizations that existed at the highest levels of government authority. The question now wasn't just who Davidson was or where her extraordinary capabilities had originated. The question was why someone with her background had chosen to surface at their remote forward operating base, and what her presence meant for everyone who had witnessed her demonstration of abilities that transcended normal human limitations in electronic warfare. The secure video conference that changed everything began at 03:00 hours with participants whose faces appeared on encrypted terminals that had been installed in Colonel Stone's command post within the previous 6 hours. General Morrison from Strategic Communications Command was joined by Dr. Angela Foster from Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and Agent Samuel Torres from an intelligence organization whose name was never mentioned during the briefing. Colonel Stone, General Morrison began, his expression carrying the weight of someone about to reveal information that would fundamentally alter her understanding of current events. What I'm about to share with you is classified at levels that require your oath of secrecy regarding everything discussed in this conversation. Dr. Foster activated a presentation system that displayed technical diagrams showing human brain activity, integrated with electronic communications, equipment through interfaces that looked more like science fiction than military technology. Project Echo Chamber was designed to address a critical limitation in modern electronic warfare, the human cognitive bottleneck that prevented operators from processing the massive amounts of signal data required for effective communications intelligence. The project had begun 8 years earlier when defense analysts realized that enemy forces were using electronic warfare techniques so sophisticated that normal human operators couldn't process countermeasures quickly enough to maintain communications superiority. Traditional training methods couldn't bridge the gap between human cognitive capacity and the processing speeds required for modern electronic warfare. Asterisk. We developed neural interface technology, Dr. Foster continued, that allowed operators to process radio frequency data directly through their nervous systems rather than relying on conventional analytical methods. The results exceeded every theoretical prediction we had established. The enhancement process involved surgical implantation of microscopic interfaces that connected brain tissue to electronic processing systems, allowing operators to think in frequencies rather than just hearing them. Their cognitive processing became synchronized with radio equipment, enabling them to understand complex signal patterns instantly and implement countermeasures through mental commands rather than manual controls. Elizabeth Davidson was our most successful subject, Dr. Foster revealed, displaying psychological evaluations that showed cognitive abilities that had been enhanced beyond normal human limitations. Her neural integration achieved 97% efficiency, allowing her to process electronic warfare scenarios that would overwhelm teams of conventional operators. But the enhancements had produced unexpected consequences that became apparent only after the operators began field deployments. Their enhanced cognitive abilities continued developing beyond the parameters that had been established during laboratory testing, evolving in ways that couldn't be predicted or controlled through normal research protocols. They didn't just become better at electronic warfare, Agent Torres explained. They began thinking in ways that transcended normal human consciousness. Their enhanced abilities were expanding into areas we hadn't anticipated and couldn't regulate. Elizabeth Davidson's field reports had described experiences that challenged fundamental assumptions about human cognitive capacity. She could perceive electronic signals as physical sensations, process multiple frequencies simultaneously without conscious effort, and implement electronic warfare solutions that emerged from intuitive understanding rather than analytical reasoning. More disturbing were indications that her enhanced abilities were continuing to evolve during operational deployments. Her mission reports described electronic warfare techniques that hadn't been programmed into her neural interfaces, suggesting that the enhancement process had triggered cognitive development that was proceeding independently of the original technological parameters. The final mission, Agent Torres continued, involved electronic warfare support for a classified operation in hostile territory. Elizabeth was providing communications intelligence when enemy forces implemented jamming techniques that shouldn't have been possible using known technology. The enemy electronic warfare capabilities had exceeded intelligence estimates by orders of magnitude, suggesting they possessed technical knowledge that rivaled or surpassed American research initiatives. Elizabeth's enhanced cognitive abilities had been the only effective counter to hostile jamming systems that were neutralizing conventional military communications across the entire operational theater. She went beyond mission parameters, General Morrison revealed, displaying after-action reports that had been classified at presidential levels. Instead of just maintaining communications for our forces, she launched an autonomous electronic warfare assault that destroyed enemy communications infrastructure across 3 countries. The scope of her actions had exceeded authorization levels that existed within normal military command structures. Elizabeth had used her enhanced abilities to implement electronic warfare operations that achieved strategic objectives, but had been accomplished through methods that weren't subject to conventional military oversight. The psychological evaluations following that mission, Dr. Foster explained, indicated that Elizabeth's cognitive enhancement had evolved beyond our ability to understand or control. She was thinking at levels that transcended normal human consciousness, implementing solutions that emerged from cognitive processes we couldn't monitor or predict. The decision to terminate Project Echo Chamber had been made not because of failure, but because of success that couldn't be managed through existing institutional frameworks. Enhanced operators whose capabilities exceeded normal human limitations couldn't be integrated into conventional military structures that were designed around predictable behavioral parameters. Elizabeth was offered retirement with full benefits and medical support for her neural modifications, Agent Torres revealed. But she refused extraction and disappeared during the mission debrief. She's been classified as a rogue asset for 18 months. The implications of Davidson's presence at Forward Operating Base Ridgeline were becoming clear. She hadn't appeared randomly. She had chosen their location for reasons that related to the hostile electronic warfare activities they'd been experiencing. The jamming systems that isolated your communications, General Morrison explained, were similar to techniques used by the same enemy forces Elizabeth engaged during her final official mission. She recognized the electronic warfare signatures and intervened using capabilities that officially no longer exist. Dr. Foster displayed intelligence reports showing enemy electronic warfare development that had been proceeding in parallel with American research initiatives. They've been developing their own neural enhancement programs, creating operators whose abilities rival what we achieved through Project Echo Chamber. The electronic warfare confrontation that had occurred around Forward Operating Base Ridgeline represented more than just communications jamming. It was evidence of technological competition between enhanced human operators whose capabilities transcended normal military boundaries. Elizabeth's intervention, Agent Torres concluded, prevented enemy forces from completing electronic warfare testing that would have compromised American communication security across multiple operational theaters. Her actions were unauthorized but strategically necessary. Colonel Stone processed the revelation that her communications crisis had actually been part of a classified electronic warfare confrontation between enhanced operators whose abilities existed outside normal military hierarchies. Davidson's presence hadn't been coincidental. It had been a strategic intervention by someone whose loyalty to American interests transcended official command structures. What happens now? Colonel Stone asked, understanding that her forward operating base had become the center of conflicts that existed at levels of national security she'd never imagined. Elizabeth Davidson represents capabilities that are too valuable to lose and too dangerous to control through conventional methods, General Morrison replied. Her actions at your base have demonstrated that enhanced operators can function effectively outside official oversight while maintaining loyalty to strategic objectives. The briefing concluded with instructions that fundamentally altered Colonel Stone's understanding of her command responsibilities. Davidson would remain at Forward Operating Base Ridgeline under informal arrangements that provided her with operational freedom, while maintaining her access to resources she required for continued electronic warfare activities. She's no longer officially part of any military organization, Agent Torres explained, but her continued operations serve American interests in ways that conventional forces cannot accomplish. Colonel Stone realized that her forward operating base had become something unprecedented, a facility that provided support for an enhanced operator whose capabilities existed beyond normal military boundaries, but whose actions continued serving strategic objectives that were too important to abandon. The transformation of Forward Operating Base Ridgeline began subtly, manifesting in ways that took weeks for personnel to recognize as permanent changes rather than temporary improvements. Davidson's continued presence created ripple effects that extended far beyond the communications bunker, where she'd first demonstrated her extraordinary capabilities. Staff Sergeant Briggs noticed the changes first during routine equipment maintenance. Radio systems that had required constant adjustment to maintain optimal performance were now functioning with precision that exceeded manufacturer specifications. More puzzling, the equipment seemed to be automatically optimizing its own performance parameters, implementing improvements that shouldn't have been possible without direct programming modifications. It's like the radios learned from watching her work, Briggs explained to Corporal Huang during a maintenance session that revealed diagnostic readings they'd never seen before. The frequency synthesis modules are coordinating with each other in ways that aren't programmed into the original software, but somehow they're achieving better performance than we ever got through manual adjustments. Davidson had established an unofficial workshop in a converted storage facility where she spent her time developing electronic warfare capabilities that served strategic objectives while remaining invisible to formal military oversight. Her work involved creating communications intelligence systems that could monitor hostile activities across vast geographic areas while providing early warning for threats that conventional reconnaissance couldn't detect. Asterisk. The intelligence gathering results were remarkable. Within 3 weeks of her arrival, Forward Operating Base Ridgeline had become a collection point for electronic intelligence that revealed enemy force movements, weapon system deployments, and operational planning activities across their entire theater of operations. Information that would normally require satellite surveillance and specialized reconnaissance units was being gathered through Davidson's enhanced ability to process radio frequency data that other operators couldn't even detect. She's providing intelligence that's changing how we understand enemy capabilities in this entire region, Colonel Stone reported during secure communications with higher command. Her electronic warfare systems are revealing activities that we didn't know were occurring and threat levels that exceed our previous assessments. But Davidson's impact extended beyond technical capabilities to influence how the base personnel approach their own professional responsibilities. Communications specialists began thinking about radio frequencies in more sophisticated ways, developing an intuitive understanding of signal propagation and interference patterns that enhanced their effectiveness even when working with conventional equipment. Private Webb discovered that his troubleshooting abilities had improved dramatically since working alongside Davidson. "I can hear things in radio static that I never noticed before," he explained to colleagues who were experiencing similar enhancements in their technical skills. "It's like she taught us to listen to frequencies differently, not just with our ears but with some kind of deeper understanding of how radio signals actually work." The psychological impact was equally significant. Personnel throughout the base began approaching complex problems with confidence that emerged from witnessing someone demonstrate capabilities that transcended normal human limitations. Davidson's example had shown them that extraordinary solutions were possible when conventional approaches proved inadequate. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell, the base intelligence officer, found that Davidson's electronic warfare intelligence was revolutionizing their understanding of enemy operations. The information she's providing reveals planning activities that indicate much more sophisticated enemy capabilities than our intelligence estimates suggested, she reported. "We're tracking communications between hostile units that suggest coordination at levels we didn't know existed." More importantly, Davidson's intelligence gathering was preventing enemy operations before they could be implemented. Her ability to monitor hostile communications in real time allowed her to identify threats during their planning phases, providing opportunities for countermeasures that neutralized enemy activities without direct military engagement. The base's operational effectiveness increased exponentially as Davidson's electronic warfare capabilities expanded their intelligence, gathering beyond anything achievable through conventional methods. They were now operating with situational awareness that exceeded what was available to much larger military installations that relied on standard intelligence collection systems. "She's turned our forward operating base into an electronic warfare center that rivals what major command posts achieve with hundreds of personnel and millions of dollars in specialized equipment," General Morrison observed during a classified assessment of their enhanced capabilities. Her individual contributions are providing strategic intelligence that's influencing operational planning across multiple theaters. But Davidson's presence also attracted attention from enemy forces who recognized that their communications were being monitored and disrupted by capabilities that exceeded normal military electronic warfare systems. Hostile reconnaissance activities around Forward Operating Base Ridgeline increased as enemy intelligence services attempted to understand the source of the enhanced electronic warfare capabilities they were experiencing. "They know someone with extraordinary abilities is operating from this location," Davidson explained to Colonel Stone during one of their informal briefings. "Enemy electronic warfare specialists are implementing countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize the techniques I've been using against their communications. The technological competition that had been revealed during the classified briefing was escalating into active electronic warfare confrontation between enhanced operators whose capabilities existed outside normal military boundaries. Davidson's continued operations were being challenged by enemy forces whose own neural enhancement programs were producing operators with comparable abilities. This is evolving into something beyond conventional military conflict, Colonel Stone realized as she reviewed intelligence reports showing enemy electronic warfare activities that suggested capabilities rivaling Davidson's enhanced abilities. We're witnessing technological competition between enhanced human operators whose actions could influence strategic outcomes without official oversight from either side. Davidson's response was to expand her electronic warfare operations beyond defensive measures to active disruption of enemy enhancement programs. Using her neural interfaces to process electronic intelligence at unprecedented scales, she began identifying and targeting the communication networks that supported enemy operator training and deployment. I can disrupt their neural enhancement procedures by interfering with the electronic systems they use for operator conditioning, she explained, implementing electronic warfare attacks that targeted enemy facilities conducting parallel research. To Project Echo Chamber, if I can prevent them from creating more enhanced operators, the technological advantage shifts permanently in our favor. The scope of her operations had expanded beyond supporting forward operating base Ridgeline to conducting strategic electronic warfare that influenced the balance of enhanced capabilities between opposing forces. Davidson was using her extraordinary abilities to ensure that American interests maintained superiority in technologies that were reshaping the fundamental nature of military conflict. Colonel Stone realized that her command had become the center of technological competition that existed at the highest levels of national security, conducted by enhanced operators whose capabilities transcended normal military boundaries, but whose actions were determining strategic outcomes that would influence global security for decades to come. 6 months after Davidson's arrival, forward operating base Ridgeline had become something unprecedented in military history, a facility where enhanced human capabilities were quietly reshaping the fundamental nature of electronic warfare while maintaining the appearance of a routine desert outpost. The changes were visible to anyone who understood what to observe. Communications equipment that had once required teams of specialists to operate effectively was now managed by individual personnel whose intuitive understanding of radio frequency principles allowed them to achieve results that exceeded traditional training outcomes. The base's electronic warfare capabilities rivaled major command centers despite having a fraction of their personnel and resources. Staff Sergeant Briggs, now functioning as an unofficial liaison between Davidson and the bases. Conventional military operations had developed technical skills that amazed visiting specialists from higher command. His ability to diagnose complex electronic problems instantly and implement solutions that pushed equipment beyond manufacturer specifications had earned him recommendations for advanced technical positions that he'd never considered pursuing. It's not that she taught us specific techniques, Briggs explained to a team of electronic warfare specialists who had arrived to study the base's enhanced capabilities. It's more like she showed us how to think about radio frequencies as living systems that respond to understanding rather than just mechanical manipulation. The visiting specialists were documenting phenomena that challenged conventional assumptions about the relationship between human cognition and electronic systems. Personnel throughout the base were demonstrating abilities that suggested their proximity to Davidson's enhanced capabilities had triggered permanent improvements in their own technical intuition and problem-solving abilities. Corporal Wong had become capable of monitoring multiple radio frequencies simultaneously while processing the tactical implications of intercepted communications in ways that normally required teams of intelligence analysts. Her reports were being forwarded to strategic command levels that recognized her individual contributions were providing intelligence that influenced operational planning across multiple theaters. I can hear patterns in enemy communications that reveal their intentions before they've finished planning their operations, she reported during interviews with intelligence specialists who were trying to understand how exposure to enhanced capabilities had improved normal human performance. It's like the radio frequencies carry more information than just the words being transmitted. But the most significant changes were occurring at levels that couldn't be easily documented or replicated through conventional training methods. Base personnel were developing collaborative approaches to complex problems that emerged from shared understanding of principles that Davidson had demonstrated through her example rather than formal instruction. The psychological transformation was equally profound. Military personnel who had spent their careers working within the limitations of standard procedures were now approaching challenges with creativity and confidence that reflected their exposure. To someone whose capabilities transcended normal human boundaries, Lieutenant Mitchell had developed intelligence analysis methods that integrated electronic warfare data with conventional reconnaissance to create a comprehensive understanding of enemy activities that exceeded what major intelligence centers achieved with vastly greater resources. Her techniques were being studied by analysts throughout the military intelligence community, who couldn't explain how she had developed such sophisticated approaches to information synthesis. Working with Davidson changed how I think about information itself, Mitchell explained during classified briefings where her methods were being evaluated for broader implementation. I learned to perceive connections between different types of data that create understanding beyond what any single source can provide. The strategic implications extended far beyond forward operating base ridgeline. Davidson's electronic warfare operations had successfully disrupted enemy enhancement programs while demonstrating that enhanced human capabilities could be integrated into military operations without compromising operational security or command authority. Her success had influenced policy decisions at the highest levels of government regarding the future development of human enhancement technologies. Rather than terminating such programs entirely, strategic planners were now considering approaches that could harness enhanced capabilities while maintaining institutional oversight and ethical boundaries. Elizabeth Davidson represents proof that enhanced human abilities can serve strategic objectives while maintaining loyalty to democratic values. General Morrison reported during congressional briefings that were classified at levels requiring presidential authorization. Her operations have demonstrated that technological enhancement of human capabilities can strengthen rather than threaten institutional frameworks. The broader implications were revolutionary. Davidson's example had shown that individuals whose capabilities transcended normal human limitations could choose to use their abilities to elevate others rather than dominate them. Her influence on base personnel had created a model for how enhanced capabilities could generate widespread improvements in human performance through collaborative rather than hierarchical relationships. But perhaps most importantly, her presence had demonstrated that extraordinary abilities carried responsibilities that extended beyond individual achievement to encompass the development of others who might never achieve similar enhancement but could benefit from exposure to transcendent capabilities. The communications bunker, where Davidson had first demonstrated her abilities, had been unofficially designated as a training facility, where personnel from throughout the military were rotated through assignments designed to expose them to enhanced electronic warfare methods. Not formal instruction, but experiential learning that occurred through proximity to capabilities that operated beyond normal human limitations. She's created something that will continue developing long after she moves on to other assignments. Colonel Stone observed during her final report about Davidson's impact on base operations. The personnel who've worked with her have been permanently changed in ways that will influence their entire careers and the careers of everyone they train in the future. New personnel arriving at Forward Operating Base Ridgeline discovered that the standards for technical competence, problem-solving creativity, and collaborative excellence were higher than anything they'd experienced in previous assignments. Not through formal requirements or documented procedures, but through exposure to colleagues whose capabilities had been elevated, through contact with someone whose abilities transcended normal human boundaries. The legacy wasn't just improved electronic warfare capabilities or enhanced intelligence gathering. It was proof that human potential could be expanded through interaction with individuals who had evolved beyond standard cognitive limitations, and that such expansion could occur without sacrificing the values and relationships that made such capabilities worthwhile. Davidson continued her work with the quiet competence of someone who understood that her greatest achievement wasn't demonstrating extraordinary abilities, but using those abilities to help others discover capabilities they didn't know they possessed. Her broken radio had become a symbol of problems that seemed impossible until someone with transcendent understanding showed that solutions existed beyond conventional limitations. In the end, the story wasn't about technology or enhancement or classified programs. It was about the choice to use exceptional abilities to elevate others, creating legacies that continued developing long after individual achievements had become part of history. Some capabilities, once shared, transcended the boundaries of the individuals who possessed them, becoming part of human potential that would influence generations of people who never knew the source of their enhanced abilities, but benefited from contact with someone who had chosen to use extraordinary gifts in service of others' growth and success. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.